In this lesson, we're going to look at legs and feet, although the truth is we're going to spend most of our time talking about the feet, because when we're talking about rigging legs in terms of the upper and lower legs, it's really exactly the same as rigging arms in terms of the upper and lower arm. We're going to have the same IK control on the legs that we have on the arms. And in terms of artwork preparation and parenting that artwork to the structure, either directly or using bones attached to puppet pins, it's once again really exactly the same as what we did in the arms lessons. And all the pros and cons of jointing versus puppet tooling versus using a blended joint are really all the same. And I want to make that very clear because I'm not going to go through all the different options that we looked at with the arms during this lesson on the legs and feet. But just because I don't go through every option doesn't mean you don't have all those options. You do. It would just be redundant to go through all those different options for separating and attaching the artwork when it's really so similar. Where things get a little bit different is in relation to the hands versus the feet. Now, there are some similarities. When we add our IK rigging, the controller that controls the position and rotation of the hands on an arm is going to be just like the controller on the foot that controls the position and rotation of the foot. But because the feet are making contact with the ground most of the time and have to come into contact with the ground, maybe lift up in a jump or a walk, and then return to making contact with the ground. And because they make contact with the ground in different ways, either the foot all the way flat on the ground, or up on the balls of the foot, or on tiptoe, or back on the heel, the rigging for the foot has to be fairly different. Luckily, Duick really takes care of us here with its auto rigging. As a matter of fact, I don't even recommend manually rigging legs and feet, even though we looked at that option for arms, because Duick's leg and foot auto rig is so well done and gives such a great level of control over the feet that the tiny disadvantage of not being able to choose your icon when you are auto rigging really pales compared to the benefits you get from auto rigging the legs and feet. Now, when we look at preparing the artwork for feet as compared with preparing the artwork for hands, things get a little bit simpler, at least in terms of the different options available. In the case of the feet, it's really going to be exactly like the kind of art preparation you would do for the mitten or flipper hands we looked at in the hand lessons. In other words, there's just going to be two pieces of art in the case of a jointed foot. The main part of the foot from the heel to the ball of the foot, and then the toes from the ball of the foot to the tip of the toes, which is very similar to the two-part hand we looked at in the mitten or flipper hands, where you had the palm of the hands and a single piece of art to sort of represent the fingers grouped together. Now, of course, if we're puppet tooling the feet, it's just going to be one piece of art, but we're going to puppet tool it in the same way with a single bend point at the ball of the foot. Just like with the puppet tooled hands, we had a single bend point at the knuckles between the palm and the fingers. Now, just like the arms with the mitten or flipper hands, you take the option of either jointing or puppet tooling the pieces of the foot, and jointing or puppet tooling or creating a blended joint for the upper and lower legs. And once again, you get many different possible combinations of jointing or puppet tooling, separating art or not separating art, with all the similar pros and cons we looked at with the arms and hands. And as I said before, we're not going to go through every single possible option in this lesson, but just keep in mind that you always have all those options available to you. So let's start by taking a look at a basic jointed leg and foot. Now, some of these steps are going to be very similar to what we've done with arms, but let's just go through them to look at some of the small differences. So we're going to start with Hipster Man Rig 1 here. Let's go ahead and unshy our layers. And let's first just take a little tour of our artwork. So we're going to go down to the left leg and foot parts here, the orange layers. We're going to unlock those. And what we've got are an upper leg and a lower leg. And of course, those two layers have a circular overlap at the knee, just as you would expect. And then we have a foot piece, which is the main part of the foot. And then we have a toe piece, which is basically from the ball of the foot to the end of the toes. Now note that these two layers also have a circular overlap right at the ball of the foot in order to create that clean joint when we bend the foot. Okay, let's go ahead and make our leg structure. So here under Create Structures, we want to go to Leg, and if this is the first time you're creating a leg, you want to just double check your leg options. They should default to what you need, but let's just take a look at those really quick. And we want to make sure that we have a plantigrade leg structure selected here. And we want to make sure we have all four pieces, the thigh, the calf, the foot, and the toes all selected there. And then we can go ahead and choose Create. Now remember that once we've set those preferences, from here on out we can simply click the leg structure button and we will get our leg automatically. We don't need to go into those options again. Now let's just pull this leg away from the figure really quick and take a look at the subtle differences between the arm structure and the leg structure. All right, just like the arm structure, we have an upper and a lower leg, or thigh and calf, and then we have a foot piece, which would be the equivalent of the hand piece on an arm. Then we have the toe piece, and then right at the end here we have the tip toe at the tip of the toes. And then we have this additional piece here, this little button called the heel. Now both the tip toe and the heel are very important to the rigging of the foot. You'll see that in a little bit. But again, in many ways, this is very similar to an arm, the upper arm, lower arm, hand, and fingers. But as I said, the rigging itself will be a little bit different, and we'll utilize this little heel piece that you'll see in a sec. Okay, let's go ahead and move our structures down near our artwork pieces. Let's color code them orange. And then let's solo just these structure pieces and the four marker pieces we need to snap these into place. So we need the pelvis or hip, the knee, the ankle, and the toe, which sits at that ball of the foot between the foot and the toe piece. Okay, let's go ahead and snap these into place. Obviously, our thigh will snap here to our pelvis or hip piece. Then the calf to the knee, the foot to the ankle. Then we want the toe to the toe marker here at the ball of the foot. And then we need to turn our artwork on for these other two pieces. So let's go ahead and turn on the toe and the foot artwork. And we're going to need to zoom in here. And the first thing we want to do is take this tiptoe piece and we want to place that anchor point right at the very tip of the toe. Now, if you have a big curved toe, this becomes a little trickier. And what you might want to do is put the toe anchor point right where the toe begins to leave the ground. That's often a good spot for it, but it's going to depend on your artwork. So you might have to do a little trial and error here. But in this case, we have a nice clear tip of the toe there, flat on the ground, and I want that anchor point right at that toe tip. Then we want to place the heel piece, the anchor point of the heel structure, once again exactly at the point of the heel where the heel meets the ground, right at that point. And again, if this was a curved kind of heel, again, I would place that kind of right where the bottom of the heel leaves the ground and starts to wrap up, or very near to it. But again, it depends to a certain degree on your artwork. You may have to do a little trial and error to get that just right. Okay, now that we've got our structure in place, we can go ahead and turn off the visibility of our markers. And we can turn on the visibility of our artwork. And let's go ahead and just parent the artwork up. So the upper leg to the thigh, the lower leg to the calf, the foot to the foot, and the toe to the toes. As simple as that. Now we're going to use auto rigging for this. You'll see why in just a minute. So let's go ahead and select all of the structure pieces for our leg. We're going to go to links and constraints and hit auto rig. Now let's adjust the position and appearance of our foot a little bit here. It's already purple. You may need to change your color. Mine is already purple here. It is a left piece, so we want that to be purple. If you need to change it, go ahead and do that. And then we're going to change the rotation of the foot so it kind of sits along our foot there. And let's also lower it down a little bit and size it up. The reason why I want to size it up a little bit, let's round that off to 750, is we want it to sit just outside the foot so it's easy to click and drag on. Again, we can maybe round these up, maybe 15 and 70. And the opacity down at 25. Let's make sure the anchor is the same size. Of course, all of this is optional. You can set this the way you like. Let's just check and see if our leg is bending the right way. It is, so we don't need to reverse that IK. And let's name and color code our controller, and we'll make that purple. Now I'm going to place this below the left hand because I like the controllers to go kind of in their stacking order with the character. And this is a 3/4 character with the left side towards us. So the left hand would be the topmost piece, and then the left foot, then all the central pieces for the torso and head, and then the right foot and the right hand. We'll look at that when we get a little farther with our rig. We also want to go ahead and zero out this controller right away. So let's add 0 to that. And before we start playing around with this, let's just do a little more cleanup here. Notice that these 2 new nulls have been added as part of the rigging. Let's just very briefly unlock those and turn those orange just to keep things nice and neat. And then we can go ahead and lock all of that up. And we can turn off the visibility of our structures as well. Now in many ways, again, this is very similar to an arm. It's got IK, so we can lift the foot and move it around, and the hip stays in the same place. And especially important in the case of a leg and a foot, when we move the thigh, let's just turn that on really quick. When we move the thigh piece, the foot stays on the ground. This is really wonderful for character animation to have that foot just stay on the ground while the rest of the character is moving around. One of the great advantages of an IK rig. But what's really cool here are the foot controls that Duik adds. So I'm going to close up these other effect controls, and you can see that we've got the foot roll set of controls. Now I'm going to right away just click and drag these up above these others because we will use these more than any of these others once we start animating these characters. And let's go through these really quick and see how these work. Super, super nice. So first off, we have the individual toe piece that allows us to just wiggle that toe up and down. We have the tip toe, which allows us to literally tilt the foot at the tip of the toe. And this is why we needed to place the tiptoe structure right at that point, because that's where this is going to pivot from. Then we have the heel. Now that is going to pivot off that heel position, which was where our heel structure was placed. That's why the position of the tiptoe and the heel structure are so important. And also you can see how if you have rounded artwork that, you know, if it sticks way out the back, you might need to move that back a little bit so the heel doesn't dig into the ground. Likewise with the toe. So you've got to kind of look at the situation of your artwork. But if you have a piece of artwork that's curving up and out and you put the heel too far out, then it's going to kind of pivot on air. It'll be as if the foot is floating on a little cushion of air when it rolls back on that heel or forward on that toe. So again, you've kind of got to look at your individual artwork situation to figure out exactly where you want to place that tip toe and heel. The final one, the foot roll, is really the coolest of this group of 4, and it's the one that you'll use in walk cycles. What the foot roll allows you to do is lift the heel off the ground while keeping the toes on the ground. But then when you roll backwards past 0, it now lifts up off the heel. That way, in a walk cycle, your foot can just come down to 0 in Y with the foot up off the ground and the heel down in the contact position. And then you just leave the foot at 0 in Y and then just roll the foot forward as it passes through the passing position and back to the next contact position and then through to the next step. Super, super slick and a really great way to be able to control the foot. Now, a quick note on animation, and those of you that have taken character animation boot camp will already understand this, but just to make it clear, these foot roll controls are only to be used when the foot is meant to be touching the ground, either touching on the tiptoe or touching on the heel or on the ball of the foot or what have you. In other words, when the controller is at 0 in Y, sitting on the ground. Once the foot lifts up off the ground, you do not want to use these controls to rotate and position the foot. You want to rotate the foot controller just like you would rotate the hand controller to position a hand on an arm. So when the foot is off the ground, you use the foot controller. When the foot is on the ground, then you want to use these foot roll controls if you need tiptoe, back on the heel, up on the ball of the foot, whatever. Otherwise, you'll get very strange behavior with your in-betweening and introduce a lot of chaos into your animation. Really important to understand. But these foot roll controls are incredibly powerful for walks, runs, dancing, any complicated movement with the feet. So this is why I don't recommend manually rigging legs and feet at all. The auto rig system is literally one click, couldn't be easier, and it gives you all this wonderful control over your foot. One of the many reasons why Duik Basel is so powerful. Okay, let's just quickly do our cleanup on this rig before we move on to rig 2. If you'd like to get a little practice in, go ahead and rig up the right foot using the same procedure we just used for the left foot. As always, the jointed rig is the easiest to set up, but let's take a look at a puppet tool combination. This isn't a 100% puppet tooled rig, but it combines a puppet tooled leg and a puppet tooled foot with a jointed ankle. So let's go ahead to Hipster Man Rig 2 to take a look at that. And you can see we've got some of this done already. We've actually already done the rigging on our foot. We've created our structure, and we've added our rigging, and we've got our foot roll and all that kind of good stuff. And you can see we've already puppet tooled the upper and lower leg. But I want to look at adding the puppet tool to the foot just so we can talk about a couple specific issues there. So let's go ahead and unshy these layers, and we'll go down to our orange pieces here for the left leg, and you'll note that we have a single piece for the upper and the lower leg, and then we have a single piece for the foot. Now, before we get too far, this particular foot really does not need a puppet tool because it has no texture and no detail on it at all. I'm just using it as an example. Really, the only reason you would puppet tool a foot is if you had some crazy texture or crazy detail, especially things like shoelaces and things that make it hard to divide the foot. I'll even go so far as to say I don't recommend puppet tooling the foot if you can avoid it. But there are times where you just can't avoid it. So let's take a look at how we would set that up if we can't avoid it, and then we'll kind of look at the reasons why I don't generally recommend it. So let's go ahead and solo the foot and structure pieces here. Unlock the foot and select it. and we'll go up and grab our puppet pin tool. Now, as before, we want to place our pins where the structures are, but we only need 3 pins for this foot. So we need 1 pin here at the ankle. We need a pin at the ball of the foot where the foot and the toe meet, and we need a pin at the tip of the foot. We do not need a pin where the heel structure is. That's not going to be necessary. As before, we want to change our puppet engine to Legacy and make sure we have an expansion of 5 and triangles of 1500. With a piece of art as small as a foot, you could maybe turn the triangles down a little bit if you're having performance issues, but I'm just going to keep mine at 1500. And then, as we've done before, we're going to hit the U key and we're going to name our pins. Now, as I've mentioned before, I generally like to name puppet pins after the joint rather than the body part. That's a personal choice, which is why I call this first pin ankle. I use toes for the second pin because ball of the foot is really a mouthful and takes up too much space. So I just go ahead and use the same terminology used for the structure, for the toes and the tiptoe. And if you prefer, you can call this L foot if you want, which would then coincide with the structure naming as well. Again, however you choose to name and organize is really up to you. Once you've got your pins named, of course, we're going to select them. And we're going to hit Add Bones under Links and Constraints to add those bone shapes. And then we will turn those orange just to keep them in line with our other left foot rig pieces here. And then we can go ahead and parent this up. So the ankle to the foot, the toes to the toes. And now this is different. The tiptoe is not going to go to the tiptoe structure. The way this rigging works, that would not allow us to wiggle that little toe. So what we need to do is parent the tiptoe bone also to the toe structure. Remember, we also want to make sure that the foot artwork is also parented in, and so that should go to the foot structure. Okay, now we're going to need to add some starch here. Let's go ahead and turn off the visibility and lock our bones, and we can turn off the visibility of our structures as well. Let's turn on our leg and our controller here. And you can see, of course, we're able to pick up and move that foot and, of course, rotate it as well. And we can use our foot roll control. So you can see now we can wiggle that toe. See how it's bending that toe? We can still go up on the tiptoe, back on the heel, and we have our foot roll as well. And you can see one of the issues with using the puppet tool is that the foot tends to kind of squish and bend into the ground when we do that heel roll or when we wiggle the toes. So you can see how the foot is kind of pushing down into the ground, and it ends up looking a little sloppy. The character doesn't feel really firmly rooted to the ground when you see that kind of wiggling underneath the foot. Now, starching will help this, but it rarely fixes it entirely. So let's go ahead and add a little starch and take a look at that. So we're going to select the foot, hit the E key, hit the puppet, and go ahead and grab our starch tool. And we can start by adding some starch to the toe here. Let's pull the extent back. And just like we would with an arm or a leg, we want to leave a bendy spot in the middle where that toe pin is in the middle there. And then let's put some starch on the back of the foot. Oh, we need to pull that extent out just a little bit to get that all the way out. And again, we'll leave a flexible spot there. We may need to adjust that a little bit, but let's see how that's looking. So we pull up the foot roll now. You can see that it's fixed some of that, but we're still kind of pushing that toe into the ground. We're still not getting like a real solid, flat sense of that foot being on the ground. It's not too bad. It's better than it was, but it's still a little bit wobbly. Same when we wiggle the toe here. You can see how that kind of pushes the middle part of the foot down into the ground. Okay, I'm getting quite a bit of pinching there, so I'm maybe going to pull this starch back just a little bit. Let's try just giving a little more room for flexibility there in the middle. Let's see if that makes that pinching any better. Yeah, that's a little bit better. Still pinches, of course, but it's pinching a little bit less. Okay. That's probably about as good as we can get it. Now let's remember again that compared with our jointed rig here, let's just take a look at this for comparison. When we lift this foot with the jointed version, that toe piece stays absolutely rock solid on the ground. And it's really a much more realistic look in terms of that sense of gravity pushing that foot down. And same when we wiggle the toe. When we wiggle the toe, the main part of the foot also stays perfectly rooted to the ground, and it again has a more realistic look. So my general recommendation is, if you can, joint the foot and the toe. Whenever possible, joint the foot and the toe. Only puppet tool that foot when you absolutely have to, because the detail or the texture just doesn't make it possible to separate those two pieces. In fact, I'll go a step further. I would even recommend that you try, if you have control over the design of the character, try to design the character so that you can joint the foot and the toe piece. If you can think ahead in those terms, you're going to get a much cleaner rig on that foot. Now also note that in this case, we didn't try to puppet tool the entire leg. I would also recommend that you always try to joint at the ankle between the lower leg and the foot. Just like we looked at when we compared jointing at the wrist between the lower arm and the hand versus puppet tooling at the wrist. Remember that when you puppet tooled at the wrist, when you bent the hand, you got a lot of wiggle in the arm, especially if the puppet tool was all the way from the hand through the lower arm and the upper arm. When you would rotate that hand, you would get a lot of wiggle in the arm, and the same thing is true with the foot. It's always going to be cleaner and work better if you have a joint at the ankle rather than a puppet tool from the lower leg down into the foot. Now, of course, sometimes you don't have any other option than puppet tooling, and in some really extreme cases, your only option is a 100% puppet tool rig. So let's take a look at that. Let's clean up here really quick first. And then let's move on to the superhero woman rig. So with this character, because of all of the detail up and down this leg, and through these complicated boots, there is no place where we can easily separate this artwork. So the only option for this leg is a 100% puppet tooled rig. So let's take a look at this. We've actually got this already rigged up. So if we pick it up and move it, you can see that it works okay, but it takes a lot of real ninja starching and some work with the overlap tool here to make sure that the folds in the clothing work correctly. And you can see even so, we've still got some kind of strange behavior happening. We've got a nice fold in the clothing here, but this little strap is sort of disappearing in a little bit of an unusual way. That's a really tough thing to have complicated art at a knee. It's another really good tip if you have control over the design process. To avoid complicated artwork at the joints is always good. Same with these boots. So you can see as we've pulled this up, see how this boot is starting to deform in kind of a difficult way there. It's not exactly ideal. And if we bend this foot, look at how much movement we end up getting in that calf, that lower leg. Gives us a lot of kind of random movement there that's not always desirable and is just kind of a loss of control from an animation standpoint. And then let's look at our foot roll here as we lift this up. It works okay, but again, we're getting a lot of wobble on the bottom of the toe there as we lift that up, and some not exactly ideal deformation in the foot. Now I could maybe spend a little more time on the starching here. I already spent a lot of time on the starching, getting it as far as this. Wiggling the toe here, look at that. We get so much movement in that heel. It's as if the heel isn't even on the ground anymore. It's just sliding around. That's not a very good look, and it, again, kind of belays the reality of our character. But we really had no other option here. There wasn't much else we could do. So it's not that it doesn't work. And with careful starching, you can get decent deformation. You can at least minimize some of the wiggle and so forth. But it's never going to be as clean as jointing. But there's very little opportunity for jointing along this leg. And what that means is that we have a more limited range of motion, where this leg can only do so much before it starts to look pretty funky. When we start to really extremely pose this, it starts to look pretty weird. Got some really bad overlap here happening, some really bad pinching, and unfortunately correcting this would make it look much, much worse when it's not nearly bent so much. So if I really bend this foot up, obviously that doesn't look very good. So this is that idea of range of motion, that you're always going to be sort of striking a balance between jointing and puppet tooling and the amount of range of motion you get. Jointing is always going to give you a greater range of motion. Puppet tooling is always going to limit your range of motion to some degree. But at the same time, jointing disrupts artwork and may force you to cut apart complicated textured artwork that also doesn't look very good. So you've got to kind of push and pull back between all of these different pros and cons. Now, a real quick thing I want to show you before we're done here. You'll notice that when we create a leg structure, and let's just really quick just pop another leg in here. Notice that the leg structure always defaults to pointing to the character's right. Well, in this case, our character is pointed to her left. But you don't have to worry about that. Let's just pretend really quick that we're going to rig up this left leg here. I'm going to unshy my layers and we'll just quickly solo the left leg and the left leg structures. And if I was going to position this on that leg, I would just go ahead and position it. I don't need to flip it in any way. I can just go ahead and position the pieces just as I'm doing here. And when I get to the toe structure, I can just swing it over here into place. And then when I get to the tip toe here, I can just swing that around into place. And then when I grab the heel, I can just slide that back into its place. Oops, that tip toe really needs to be right on the tip, doesn't it? And then we want that heel back at the tip of the heel. I can just position it that way, and it's going to rig up just fine. So when I select these and I go ahead and I auto-rig, it doesn't care that I repositioned any of that stuff. Notice my IK is backwards, but I can, of course, flip that. But everything works just normally, and the toe roll and the heel roll and all that good stuff all works just fine. So you don't have to worry about the direction that default leg appears. You can just position it as you saw me do, rig it up, it'll work just fine. Okay, that's it for legs and feet. Duik makes this so easy with its wonderful auto rig, so it's one of the most straightforward parts of the body to rig. Now I just want to remind you again, we didn't look at every possible option in terms of jointing versus puppet tooling versus blended joints. We didn't look at a blended joint, but could you do the upper and lower leg as a blended joint? Of course you could. Just because I didn't show you every option that we looked at with the arms doesn't mean you don't have all those options. So jointing, puppet tooling, blended joints for the upper and lower leg, and then jointing and puppet tooling for the feet, in whatever combination works best for your artwork and the situation that you're dealing with. In the next lesson, we'll start our look at rigging torsos and then hooking up our arms and legs to make a full body rig. See you in the next lesson.